It's always one of the highlights of a St. Louis spring, the Bob Costas benefit for Cardinal Glennon Children's Medical Center. It all started 26 years ago.
A bright young man, a big sports fan, Jerry Seinfeld. Jerry?
I am a big sports fan, and I'm a big Ozzie Smith fan. I think he's a tremendous ball player. And I can only imagine the thrill it must be for Ozzie as a black man to be able to call your manager Whitey anytime you feel like it.
You know, when I play my harmonica, I like to play with my eyes closed. I could hear the notes and I can concentrate. So we're playing this song, you know, and about halfway through the song, I looked up and half the people were sleeping.
By the time it began, Bob Costas had already established himself as one of the best sportscasters in the country.
Hi, everybody. Bob Costas back in New York along with Ahmad Rashad and Pete Axtell.
In the studio or in the booth.
Into left center field and deep. This is a tie ball game.
He seemed just as comfortable broadcasting elevator races on Late Night with David Letterman.
David, the atmosphere down here is incredibly tense. I'd have to liken it to the scene at the 18th green of a Masters golf tournament.
Or doing an Emmy Award-winning interview with now convicted pedophile Jerry Sandusky.
Innocent, completely innocent and falsely accused in every aspect.
Here is Bob Costas.
Of course, to most Americans, Bob Costas is probably best known as the host of the biggest show on television, the Olympic Games, which he's been doing now since 1992. Still, he always comes back to St. Louis, and thanks in part to the Bob Costas benefit, the Bob Costas Cancer Center has been saving lives ever since it opened in 1998. So sit back as we sit down with, we'll say it because he won't, a broadcasting legend. And joining me now is the only broadcaster in television history to win Emmys in news, entertainment, and sports, Bob Costas. Thanks for joining us, Bob. You're here at the Fox Theater. I'm just wondering, you must have some great memories of this building.
You know, if I were to list all the things that I've been lucky enough to be involved in, very, very near the top of the list would be what we've been able to do for Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital and all the events here at the Fox Theater and all the tremendous entertainers who gave of their time and talents to help us raise funds. And it was different from the average fundraiser. You know, eventually it became no dais, no speeches, no pleas for donations, just you know what your ticket is going toward, but just come and have a good time. It'd be a night you'd want to be at even if there weren't a cause attached to it. And then this past Saturday to kind of put a ribbon on it with Martin Short and Diana Ross was pretty good.
It was pretty good. And I want to talk more about your involvement with Cardinal Glennon a little later in our show. But let's begin with St. Louis, because there is an impression that you were born and raised here, which is not the case. But you told me when people ask you where you're from, you say St. Louis.
Oh, yeah. I say St. Louis. If people from New York want to compare notes about Long Island or Queens or going to Yankee games as a kid, that's part of my life too. The 1964-65 New York World's Fair is part of my life too. But I consider myself to be a St. Louis, and I think of St. Louis as my hometown. I've lived more than half of my life and most of my adult life in St. Louis, so yeah.
And it all started because you applied for a job at KMOX Radio. Take me back. Didn't you have to make a tape to get that job?
I was at Syracuse University entering my senior year, and I get a job broadcasting minor league hockey in the old Eastern Hockey League, the Paul Newman Slapshot League. I actually knew guys who were extras in the movie.
Hanson brothers.
Yeah, well, the Hanson brothers I didn't know, but guys, actual hockey players who had played in the Eastern Hockey League were extras in the movie. Anyway, so I was doing these games, right, for $30 a game and $5 a day meal money on the road. And for that reason, I cut back my course load at Syracuse. So I had yet to graduate. So I'm going to finish up the credits that remain in the fall of 1974. And a friend of mine says there's a team coming to St. Louis from Carolina. The Carolina Cougars of the ABA are becoming the Spirits of St. Louis, and they don't have an announcer. So I got to find a basketball tape. And the only basketball tape I had was a game I had done between Syracuse and Rutgers when I was 20 years old as a sophomore on the campus radio station. So I listened to it, and I find a sequence that's pretty good. And I edit out all the parts that are a little hesitant. And if I have to edit out the score because a good part came from the second half and I want to attach it to the first half, I just edited out the score. Rutgers with the ball, Syracuse with the ball. And then I had an engineer friend of mine re-record it with the treble down and the bass up. So I would sound louder and older and more authoritative.
Yeah.
And I sent the tape to the Spirits and to KMOX. And lo and behold, I got the job.
You got the job, and that began your trip to St. Louis. Did you make a trip here and went to Stan Musial's restaurant? Tell me about that. Was that for that job?
Bob Hyland had me in for an interview. And, you know, you talk about an imposing figure. Bob Hyland was a great man, and he had a great and positive effect on my life that I can never overstate the gratitude I feel. But when you interviewed with Bob Hyland, I mean, it was like central casting. It sent in a judge or a senator. It was, you know, such an immaculate and impressive figure. And he says, well, we like you. We want you to meet Jack Buck. Oh my God, I'm going to meet Jack Buck, because even though I wasn't from St. Louis, you know, Jack did a lot of national games. He'd done the Super Bowl on CBS and whatnot. So everybody who wanted to be a sports broadcaster knew who Jack Buck was. He was already on Mount Rushmore. So they take me to the old Stick-Spare and Fuller, and Jack is getting his hair cut. And I'm talking to him in the mirror, and he's looking at me in the mirror, and I'm behind his head. And he says, how old are you, kid? And I said, I'm 22. And he said, I have ties older than you. So I'm thinking, well, I may not get this job, and so I may not set foot in St. Louis again, so I should go to Stan Musial and Biggie's. And I did. And I had a hamburger or something. I want to emphasize the bill was less than $10. It was 1974. And I left a tip of $3.31 in cash. And the waiter was probably scratching his head, but that was an homage to Stan's lifetime batting average.
Yeah, 331. So you're in St. Louis, and you get the job as the play-by-play announcer for the St. Louis Spirits. Little did you know that you'd have stories to tell for 40 years.
Yeah, and little did I know that the first two jobs I had, the Syracuse Blazers of the Slapshot Eastern Hockey League and the Spirits, would be the two craziest experiences that I'd ever had. So by the time I'm like 23, 24 years old, I've been to the circus and back. And I knew it was crazy, but it was only through the rearview mirror that I recognized just how crazy, because no matter what happened, and a lot of experiences followed, none of it was as bizarre and just off the wall as the hockey experience and the basketball experience.
He can generate a little offense. He's the kind of man who comes off the bench and puts the ball in the bucket for you, Bill, and he replaces Milt Williams.
The Spirits, the ABA was a wild league to begin with, kind of an outlaw league to begin with. Much more wide open in every respect, on the court and off, than the NBA. But if any one team typified the whole league, for better and for worse, it was the Spirits.
One quick Marvin Barnes story.
There's lots to choose from, but the one that people want to hear most, and here we go, is we play in Louisville against the Kentucky Colonels, who are one of the best teams in the league. Louisville is drivable from St. Louis, but it's in the Eastern time zone. Naturally, we lose the game. The next morning, we gather at the airport. Teams didn't travel by charter then. Traveling secretary hands out, who was also the trainer, hands out the itinerary. It says TWA Flight 305, depart Louisville 8 a.m., arrive St. Louis 7:56. Marvin Barnes beckons me over. Bro. And then he drapes an arm around my shoulder and looks down from more than a foot above me. And he says, bro, I don't know about you, but as for me, I am not getting on any time machine.
Still to come, how a World Series moment became an emotional moment for Bob Costas and his son.
You know, I was in Victor Victoria.
Really?
Did you know that? Yeah.
Which part?
I had the James Garner part, not the Julie Andrews part. I was in Mamma Mia, too.
Really? Do you remember any songs from them you want to sing for us?
Those are all ABBA songs, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
Yeah. Fernando was my favorite. I'm a quirky guy in that respect.
Just a couple of lines.
No, I'd rather not, really. There are copyright restrictions. Otherwise, I'd be happy to.
Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah.
So how many games for MLB will you do?
Oh, I'll probably do 15 or so during the regular season, then a couple in the playoffs.
And is it still the same thrill for you that it always was? doing baseball?
I love doing baseball. And I love walking into a ballpark, especially a ballpark that has a certain feel like St. Louis does or Fenway or Wrigley does for a different reason. Nothing is ever exactly the same thrill as the first few times you do it.
Yeah.
You know, the first World Series that I did as the play-by-play man was 1995, and Cleveland's playing Atlanta. In Game 3 in Cleveland, my son Keith, who then was 9, and it's 20 years ago, and now he works for the Major League Baseball Network. School is over, and his mom puts him on a plane. He's been on many planes, but now he's going to go on a plane for the first time himself. We have somebody from NBC waiting to meet him at the airport in Cleveland. And he gets to the ballpark like the second inning of the third game of the World Series. And I'm in the booth with Euchre and Morgan. And the stage manager taps me on my shoulder. And I turn around and look over my shoulder, and there he is, 9 years old. And he already knew more about baseball than 99% of all Americans, and he's 9 years old. And you know, that kind of circumstance can't be recreated. My dad died when I was 18 years old. He never saw or heard a single thing I ever did. So it was an emotional thing.
Up next, how local broadcaster Bob Costas went national.
So how does your job at KMOX morph into a gig with NBC Sports?
1976, Al Michaels is at CBS, the young Al Michaels. He gets a job about 5 days before the first day of the football season with ABC. CBS calls Bob Hardy because KMOX had provided so much talent for them network-wise through the years. I mean, Jack Buck was a network guy and a local guy. Dan Kelly, same thing. So they get a call, Bob Hyland does, we need somebody in the next 5 days to do the 49ers at the Packers. And Bob Hyland says, I have a young man here who I think is talented. He's only 24 and he looks about half that. And they say, fine, send him to New York. So I come to New York, they look me over, and they sign me to a one-game contract for $500. And I go to Green Bay and I broadcast the 49ers and the Packers with Tommy McDonald, a Hall of Fame receiver with the old Philadelphia Eagles, one of the last guys to play without a face mask. And then he just went to a single bar. He was a wide receiver. Anyway, did the game with Tommy McDonald. I'm sure the broadcast does not belong in the Broadcasting Hall of Fame, but they like me well enough to use me as a fill-in for the next couple of years. And someone at NBC heard or saw one of the broadcasts that I'd done, and they were specifically looking to hire someone under 30 to kind of have a farm system going. And they hired me in 1980, and I was 28.
Minisama kanishiwa. Watashi wa Bob Costas.
You're 28 years old, now you're at NBC, and your first love is baseball. When did you get to do your first baseball? Because at that time, people may not remember this, but at that time, when you and I were growing up, NBC was the baseball network, and they had the game of the week for years and years.
It had almost every World Series until they began alternating with ABC at some point in the 70s. Had every World Series from 1947 on, from the first one on. So NBC and Saturday afternoon baseball were synonymous. Kurt Gowdy, Joe Garagiola, Tony Kubek, later on Vin Scully. In 1980, they used me as a fill-in on some games. In fact, I did a couple of games with Tim McCarver in 1980. And by 1981, they were using me more often. And in 82, they put me in as the second announcer on the Game of the Week. And in 1983, when they hired Vin Scully, they had to break up the great pair of Joe Garagiola and Tony Kubek. And I wound up with Tony Kubek, which really gave my career a boost because Tony had a tremendous national profile. And then they started dividing the country in half. The backup game was primarily, for many years, just in case it rained on the lead game and we'd go to like 2% of the country. Now they started doing doubleheaders, and so the game that we did went to the whole country. Stuff like the Ryne Sandberg game at Wrigley Field. And then eventually, I would do one of the LCSs and with Tony, and Vin and Joe would do the other. And then if we had the World Series, I would host the World Series, and Vin and Joe would call the game.
Right, and wasn't the Cardinals World Series against the Brewers, was that the first World Series you were involved in?
First World Series I was involved in was the Cardinals. I was 30 years old, and it was Cardinals against Brewers, and I did the pre and the post-game show, and it was just so exciting to be involved in a World Series, period. but to have it be in St. Louis and all the excitement around your hometown and all the good feeling, that was really a great memory.
And I think you mentioned the Ryne Sandberg game, but that's a game a lot of people in St. Louis will remember because it's 1984.
Yeah.
Bruce Sutter was the best relief pitcher in baseball. Ryne Sandberg was emerging as one of the best players in baseball. And that game is one of the most memorable games, even though the Cubs won the game in a year that they actually won the division for the first time since 1945. That was a very memorable game.
It's the most memorable regular season baseball game that I've ever broadcast. He hit a home run to tie it in the 9th off Sutter.
Into left center field and deep. This is a tie ball game.
And a 2-run homer to tie it again in the 10th off Sutter.
1-1 pitch.
I mean, the way pitchers were used was different then. I think they brought Sutter, and I think Whitey brought him in the 7th, and he pitched through the 10th.
Yeah.
And Sandberg had 5 hits that day. 2 of them were last-ditch game-tying home runs. And because the game was nationally televised, and because there was almost no cable TV then and no MLB network and ESPN was in its infancy and teams televised only a handful of local games, if you were a baseball fan, you didn't mow your lawn during those 3 hours. The whole country's watching.
Right.
And all of baseball pretty much is watching. The other players used to refer to the game of the week as the game of the world. If they'd see us on Friday at the batting, oh, tomorrow must be the game of the world. So really that game put Sandberg on the map. And he became the MVP that year. And people forgot that in that same game, Willie McGee hit for the cycle, and Ozzie made naturally a couple of highlight reel plays. It was just a great, great baseball game. And I remember saying to Tony Kubek, you know what? This is a telephone game, and this is before people had cell phones. This is the kind of game where you call up your friends, you go, are you watching this? Yeah. And it could, except for the fact that the game is in color, it could just as well be 1954 as 1984. Just a classic setting and a classic game.
And it was just a few years later that you were there in 1988 when Kirk Gibson hit his home run. Jack Buck called it, Vin Scully called it, memorable calls both. Where were you, and take us through that?
First of all, as great as the moment was, Gibson's heroic homer off Eckersley, and it changed an entire World Series where the Dodgers were huge underdogs. I don't think people would remember it nearly as well if it weren't for 2 of the greatest calls in the history of baseball on the same play.
High fly ball into right field. She is gone!
Scully on television, and
Gibson swings and a fly ball to deep right field. This is going to be a home run. Unbelievable! A home run for Gibson. I don't believe what I just saw.
And Buck on the radio. Where I was, I'd gone down to the Dodger dugout because they anticipated that I'd be doing the losing team's interview after the game, and Marv Albert was on the other side, on the Oakland side. And as I'm standing there in the top of the 9th, I can hear Kirk Gibson taking batting practice off a tee into a net, because he apparently was sitting in the clubhouse half dressed and he was supposed to not play, and it was the only at-bat he had in the whole series, just hobbling around. And he heard Vin Scully say, well, the Dodgers are without Kirk Gibson tonight. And that apparently infuriated him. And so he got dressed, and he had a ball boy, a bat boy, put the ball on the tee, and I could hear him. And with each swing, it would be like, thwack, thwack, And then Ben Hines, who was the batting coach, went down the tunnel and then comes back up, walks past me. I'm like standing in the corner trying to be inconspicuous. He walks past me, and I hear him say to Lasorda, like a line out of a B movie, he says he has one good swing in him. And then Lasorda, who could not speak if he wasn't on television, a single sentence without several profanities, said, well, that's bleeping good to bleep in here. Tell him to get his bleeping bleep out here, and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And then he turns and he sees me, and he goes, what the bleep are you doing here? And I go, I'm doing the postgame. And then he announces to the whole dugout, you see, even NBC thinks we've lost the game. Look, bleeping Costas is bleeping here. So now the next thing you know, Gibson does what he does, and I jump out on the field and interview him as soon as the game's over.
And another great memory, and a baseball memory for you. When it comes to baseball and Bob Costas, is it still your #1 love?
Baseball is definitely my favorite sport. And I don't think that baseball should apologize that it's fallen behind the cultural juggernaut that is football. Baseball is the superior pastime. It's the superior game with a superior history and a sport in which people do not brutalize one another as a matter of course. Injuries are accidental and incidental in baseball, especially head injuries.
And it went on and on.
I never said it.
Straight ahead, Bob Costas introduces me to a friend named Seinfeld.
No, I've never given it any thought. You can't blame these ball players today for getting all this money. The club owners are the ones that are giving it to them.
Sure. When you're lucky enough to hang around Bob Costas like I have, you never know who you might have the chance to interview. For me, once it was the baseball great Joe DiMaggio, who rarely did interviews. Another time, it was comedian Jerry Seinfeld.
I cannot speak on that. I can't. There's no proof of it. You can't pin it on me. Those tapes were falsified.
So we mentioned your connection to St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about St. Louis's connection to baseball. We here in St. Louis, many of us believe that this is the best baseball town in America. When you say that now, in other places, people kind of roll their eyes. What do you think?
Yeah, there's a little bit of resentment because St. Louis has been rightly celebrated, not only for the quality, historically and at present, of their franchise, but because of the loyalty, the passion, the knowledge, and the civility, by and large, of its fans, which separates it. That combination of things separates it. Are fans passionate in other places? Yes. Is Fenway an incredible experience? Yes. Is Wrigley Field a wonderful place to go? Yes. Camden Yards, AT&T Park, or Pac Bell, or whatever they call it now in San Francisco, is wonderful. Other places have their charms. But I think St. Louis has a unique combination of appealing qualities. And it remains one of the few places where baseball is still number one.
Have you relaxed your opinion at all about the wild card in baseball?
Well, what I said, none of these things are ever taken logically. You know, it has to be a black and white thing. So Bob doesn't like the wild card because he's a traditionalist. But then it's hard to explain why I advocated interleague play before they did it, why I advocated instant replay even before they did it, especially in the postseason, why I had a version of realignment that they eventually adopted, which was to take the Astros into the American League West. My objection to the wild card was simple. There's a difference between a pennant race and mere playoff qualifying. The NBA and the NHL have playoff qualifying. No one even remembers who won a division. They only remember who won the championship. A pennant race is something different. And when they broke up from one league to two divisions, you still had essentially pennant races. You had 4 of them instead of 2, but you still had to finish first. And you could finish second by the most excruciating margin. You could win 100 games and finish second and go home. And that's what gave those races their drama and their historical resonance. As soon as you have a wild card, even one, you've changed the whole nature of it. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes the wild card wasn't the best team or second best team in the league, or that they couldn't get hot at the end, or that it didn't give more fans hope. But if you're going to say that, say that. Don't act like there isn't a trade-off, because there was a trade-off. And now, the reason why I like it better is that with the second wild card, at least it puts a bit of a premium on finishing first. If you're going to be even the better of the 2 wild cards, you're exposed to losing 1 game and going home. So it does put a bonus on finishing first, so it's a little better.
Should Pete Rose be in the Hall of Fame?
I think Pete Rose should be in the Hall of Fame, and I think baseball blew it by failing to make a simple distinction that millions and millions of baseball fans can make. Hall of Fame one thing, banned from baseball another. He deserved to be banned from baseball. He violated a clear, long-standing rule that's posted on every clubhouse door. He deserved a serious punishment. It's not that I dislike Pete personally. He's a flawed person, but he obviously loves baseball, and he's likable to be around and to talk to. And he was always very kind to me when I was covering the game. But he should be banned from baseball. But the Hall of Fame ban came 2 years later. Giamatti banned him from baseball in '89. Then the board of directors of the Hall of Fame in 1991 said that anybody on the permanently ineligible list is not eligible for the Hall of Fame ballot. That was clearly aimed at Pete Rose. Certainly wasn't aimed at Shoeless Joe Jackson, who had died in 1951. So somebody got those 4,256 base hits. It's just stupid that Barry Bonds and whomever else, or all the steroid guys, are on the ballot. They may never get elected. They're on the ballot. Who do you think hurt baseball more? Steroid guys? And by the way, Barry Bonds' performance, Mark McGwire's performance, Sammy Sosa's performance was affected by steroid use. Pete Rose's performance was not enhanced by his gambling Jones. In fact, there's no evidence that he was doing it while he was a player, only while he was a manager. This is a very simple distinction. Baseball needlessly complicated it, and I hope that Rob Manfred, who has an open mind about it, as opposed to Bud Selig, who obviously had a closed mind, will untangle it.
Coming up.
Why would you do such a stupid thing?
The reason Bob Costas gave me a scolding and why you might get one too.
So, Bob, I went to Twitter the other day and I searched Bob Costas.
Why would you do such a stupid thing? You're an adult. B, you're a reasonably intelligent man. Why?
I did not see your name. Do you tweet, Bob?
No. Not only do I not tweet, I have never read anyone else's tweet. I managed to live some 50-plus years before it existed and got by just fine.
But let's talk about social media in sports, because it's had an effect.
Yeah, it's by and large anti-social media. Let's stipulate something. The internet is a wonder. Sitting here the other night, I see people with their phones, they're Googling, I know what they're Googling. How old is Diana Ross? She looks fantastic.
Right.
You can find out any kind of information you want, useful, credible information. You can also use social media to gather people for good causes. It's had a very positive effect on important issues nationally and internationally, or some kid, the family needs to raise money for a sick kid and a dying wish. All those wonderful things can happen. Plus, it also sometimes gives voice to somebody who is very insightful and very talented, and for whatever reason hasn't been hired by a newspaper or a magazine or the mainstream. It's supplemented the mainstream in many cases. You want the long version of Bernie Miklasz? You can get it, at stl.com. That's all great, but it also gives voice. Let's understand this. If you see an ad for a medication, they list all the possible side effects. The possible side effects of this new wondrous technology, not possible but obvious, is that it gives voice to every creep and cretin who ever lived or is still living. And a vast amount of what's on the internet is idiocy and vitriol and mean-spiritedness and outright falsehoods, period. It's just true. That's not a Luddite's view or a technophobe's view. It's a clear-eyed view of what's true.
And there seems to be, and I think you've noticed this because we've talked off camera about this, a lack of civility. So if Bob Costas does some kind of segment at halftime of a football game, and it's posted online, then it's opened up for comments, and it's quite disheartening sometimes to read some of the comments if people disagree.
Well, it's one thing to disagree with what someone thinks on the merits. I'm happy to defend a position I actually hold. I can't defend a position that's been distorted and misrepresented that I don't hold, and I can't be held to account for people who've never met or spoken to me. And this is true of any public figure. Any public figure will tell you, it's not unique to me at all, any public figure will tell you that they face this, or at least they're aware of it. That's why Jimmy Kimmel does mean tweets as a regular segment, and has well-known people read these moronic things that have been written about them. So I don't mind if someone disagrees on the merits, but the kind of ad hominem attacks and just nonsense that's there is something that you just shouldn't pay any attention to. Plus, you have to understand what it is. It was at first a meeting ground for people who were resentful and had no voice and just wanted to grab a megaphone and say any idiotic thing that they used to say, mumbling on a street corner or from the back of the balcony before security ushered them out. At first it was a meeting ground for people like that, but now it's a breeding ground because somehow they feel validated. And it becomes a kind of neighborhood that certain people will never enter. It's a precinct that you and I would never enter. Why would you want to be commenter 15 in between imbecile 14 and perpetually angry guy 16? So therefore, there's no leavening influence, for the most part. I mean, I've seen thoughtful and insightful and well-informed viewpoints, but they're in the minority. There's no leavening influence of reasonable, moderate people who see gray areas. It's all just people over here and people over there and people trying to vent. And if you believed, for example, social media about the Cardinals, Mike Matheny has no idea what he's doing. And there are thousands, I mean thousands, of St. Louisans who could manage the Cardinals better than Mike Matheny. Bring them on. Bring them on. Give them a uniform.
How do you think it's affected sports journalism?
Well, there's so many spokes to that wheel. You know, there's network television, then there's cable, and there's local TV, and then there's radio. Sports talk radio runs mostly on heat and not on light, and that's true of a good portion of the internet. The saddest part to me is that newspapers are in danger. Their circulations are shrinking. Pulitzer Prize level people, not just people in sports, are out looking for work because print is in decline. And editors and publishers are desperate. And so they go to the digital platform. Great. But in an ideal world, what that should be is that those newspapers, after all, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch is the Pulitzer family, all right? The New York Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, Boston Globe, whatever it is, they should be taking their standards, their quality to the internet, and upholding those standards and thinking of innovative ways to use the new technology. It's not a question of technology, it's a question of content. If something came off Gutenberg's printing press and it was a lie, it was still a lie. If it was a masterpiece, then it was a masterpiece. If it was a lie and someone scratched it on the wall of a cave with a jagged rock, it was still a lie, all right? What, sadly, the mainstream media has done in too many cases is that instead of challenging the ethos of the internet, they've capitulated to the tone and sensibility of the internet. They want the clicks. So if Mike Bush goes to speak at some high school someplace and gives the best talk of his life, and the headline says, Bush offers nuanced view of sports, news, and journalism, that's not going to get as many clicks as if somewhere in the hour you said something that can be taken out of context and it can be Bush slams Cardinals. Even if you did no such thing, maybe there's half a sentence that can be portrayed that way. And the person doing this isn't so stupid as to know that they're not doing it. It's not an accident. It's done on purpose. It's done to generate heat rather than light.
Up next, Bob Costas' emotional tribute to Stan the Man Musial.
Bob, you've had the honor of giving 2 eulogies to 2 of the greatest baseball players that ever lived, Mickey Mantle and Stan Musial. I know you had a relationship with Mickey Mantle. Mm-hmm. I know you knew Stan. But you've told me off camera that they were both very meaningful to you, but very different. How so?
Well, Mickey's death was tragic. He was only 63. He had gone to the Betty Ford Clinic and gotten clean, but the lingering effects of the life that he led caught up with him, and he had liver cancer, and that took his life barely a year after he thought he had a new lease on life. And it has to be said that he really faced it courageously, without self-pity, tried to use himself as an example, and forthrightly acknowledged where he had gone wrong. And I think he came to understand toward the end of his life. He was always so hard on himself and thought he should have been better, and in some ways maybe he should have, even as great as he was. He was haunted by a lot of things. And he came to accept the affection that millions of people felt for him. And he came to understand that because of the era in which he played, not just the numbers and the achievements, but the era in which he played, what he represented to so many people who grew up following baseball then.
And that included you.
Oh, yeah.
In the last year, Mickey Mantle, always so hard on himself, finally came to accept and appreciate that distinction between a role model and a hero. The first, he often was not. The second, he always will be.
So there was something poignant about Mickey Mantle and something very poignant about that occasion. Stan lived a full life. He was 92 or 93 years old when he passed away. When his son-in-law called me, as Stan was on his deathbed, and said that Stan had asked that I do the eulogy, I was so touched by that. And what I tried to do, just as I did in a different way with Mickey, I tried to capture as many of the thoughts that must be going through the minds of millions of people who had a feeling about Stan Musial. And what made him different from almost any other superstar is that he was part for his whole life of the place where he made his fame.
It seems that all Stan had going for him was more than 2 decades of sustained excellence as a ball player and more than 9 decades as a thoroughly decent human being.
If Ted Williams walked into a room, if Joe DiMaggio walked into a room, people would go, "Oh my gosh, Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio." If Stan walked in, "Hey, Stan!" and they know they'd get the same thing right back. What surprised me when I was doing the eulogy was that when I did Mickey's eulogy, it was an emotional circumstance, I never got choked up. I got through it. I got choked up 2 or 3 times doing Stan's. And I know the reason is because it was St. Louis. It's because in that cathedral there were so many people I knew. That one of the anecdotes was about his granddaughter going through school from kindergarten through 12th grade with my daughter. My daughter spending sleepaway nights at Lindsay Edmonds' house and the reverse. And her coming home and telling me stories of Stan the Man, bringing them on Sunday morning Egg McMuffins or Dunkin' Donuts or whatever it might be. And personal stories of Mickey Mantle staying at my house here in St. Louis and Stan Musial coming over for dinner and Mickey telling me how he felt about Stan. It was, in a way, it was more personal, and the St. Louis part, and I was embarrassed actually that I got choked up and had to regain my composure a few times. And then people told me afterwards it was nothing to feel bad about.
And you told a great story in the Stan eulogy about Stan in a locker room.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
You know, it seems like a world away, but in the mid-1950s, baseball had begun to integrate, but it wasn't fully integrated, and nothing like full fairness had been reached. So it's at an all-star game. And keep in mind, the Cardinals, regrettably, were among the last teams to integrate, didn't have a black player until 1954. This would have been 1955, 56, somewhere in there. And the great black players, Frank Robinson, Ernie Banks, Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, were in a corner of the National League All-Star Clubhouse, and they were playing cards. And none of the white players were around them. And Stan just kind of casually walked over and pulled up a folding chair and said, "Deal me in." And I don't think that was a political statement on Stan's part. It was just a statement of decency. He looked, he saw what was happening. Now think what that meant, not just to those players, enough so that Hank Aaron and Willie Mays each told me about it separately, years, decades later. They mentioned that story and how much they admired Stan Musial. But think what it meant to the white guys in that room, still by far a majority, the white guys in that room, some of them from the still Jim Crow South in 1956 or 57, whatever it was, to have the longest tenured, the most accomplished, and the most respected of them make that simple gesture. That's what Stan Musial's life was about, in addition to being a great, great baseball player. Moments of decency.
Okay, people, okay, look at this place. We're at the Fox Theater. This place is fantastic.
Coming up, the people who brought the house down at the Bob Costas benefit.
We've had Seinfeld, Billy Crystal, Jay Leno, Gary Shandling, Bill Murray, Jimmy Fallon, Cedric the Entertainer,
Conan.
Bill Maher, Conan O'Brien. I mean, you know, every one of them was terrific.
Let's make a pact. What happens in the Fox Theater stays in the Fox Theater, okay?
First, Jerry Seinfeld. Okay, people, okay, look at this place. We're at the Fox Theater. This place is fantastic.
I've already eaten my body weight in toasted ravioli.
Next up, Gilbert Gottfried.
What is this? What kind of a place is this?
Thank you.
You took a food that was already incredibly unhealthy. Pasta stuffed with cheese. That's a death sentence right there. But some genius in St. Louis said, that's not enough. We can do more. Let's cover it in breadcrumbs and then deep fry it.
Here is Bob Costas.
And here is a reset of the situation at gymnastics. Romania's Simona Amanar.
We are just a little more than a year away from Rio. When you look ahead to the Olympics, is this something you look forward to? Because I know when you first started doing the Olympic Games for NBC, this was not a dream of yours.
No.
By any stretch.
No, my dream was to call baseball, football, basketball games. I never even thought of myself as a host. A lot of things just fell into place, and I'm glad that they did, including some non-sports things like the later interview program. And as much as I admired Jim McKay, and my broadcasting idols as a kid were the guys who had a command of language, a sense of narrative, a frame of reference beyond sports that they could bring in appropriately, like Jack Buck, like Jack Whitaker, like Jim McKay and Vin Scully. So I admired Jim McKay. But I never, ever envisioned myself hosting the Olympics. And when NBC acquired the Olympics, I was just kind of there. And I'd been hosting their NFL and later NBA coverage, and they tapped me to do it. And I guess it's worked out pretty well.
It has worked out very well. Will Rio
except for Sochi. And the reason why I'm doing at least one more is sort of like, you know, you can't let the pink eye Olympics be your last Olympics. You just can't.
As you look back, do you have a favorite Olympic moment?
There have been dozens and dozens of them, but my favorite moment was Muhammad Ali lighting the torch in 1996 in Atlanta. And the way they orchestrated it, they kept it a secret from everybody, including me and Dick Enberg, and we were broadcasting the opening ceremony. And he stepped out of the shadows, and Janet Evans, a great Olympic swimmer, was the second to last torchbearer, and she handed him the torch. And even then, he was pretty much in the throes of Parkinson's, and his hand was shaking. And when he stepped out of the shadows, you heard something you hardly ever hear at an arena or stadium, an audible gasp. And it took like a couple of seconds before it really set in with people, and then thunderous applause and cheering. That was a real goosebump-raising moment.
You alluded to this just a few minutes ago. You said you needed to do at least one more because of what happened in Sochi. Are you thinking about stopping in terms of doing the Olympics?
Could, yeah. I think.
Want to elaborate?
I think we're on a case-by-case basis going forward. But when I decide to stop, whether it's that or football or whatever, it'll be on my terms. NBC has been very, very, very good to me, and I know I have a place there as long as I want. And it's possible that I could stop doing Sunday Night Football on a regular basis, stop being the primary host of the Olympics, but have some kind of role occasionally where my presence would be appropriate. But after a while, I think you should give younger people their turn, just like I got my turn, and get the heck out before they kick you out.
Straight ahead, how the great Jack Buck inspired Bob Costas to put St. Louis first.
So I did a story the other day at the Costas Cancer Center at Cardinal Glennon Children's Medical Center. I'm just wondering, I know you've been there many, many times.
Yeah.
When you see Costas Cancer Center, what does that do for you? What does that mean to you?
Well, it's very humbling, and my understanding is this, that when people are recognizable, visible, especially when what they do is something people associate with things they enjoy, that puts a smile on their face, when you're lucky enough to be attached to that, then, you know, your name serves a purpose. Do I deserve anything like the credit that the nurses and the doctors and the volunteers deserve? No, but I get it that this event every year here and the name is helpful. I think Jack Buck set an example for all of us here in St. Louis. As great a broadcaster as Jack was, he was as great an ambassador for St. Louis and as great a fundraiser for worthy causes, but he could not have done those things if people didn't know him and like him as the voice of the Cardinals. So I get it. Do I deserve it? No, but I get that it serves a purpose.
Is there anything in your career that you have yet to do that you still want to do?
No specific event. I think that when I transition out of some of the things that I'm doing now, I'll still continue to do baseball. Both I enjoy doing the games, and I also enjoy the long-form interviews, panel-type discussions that the Major League Baseball lets you do, and that network television just isn't geared toward. And I'd like to return in some form to the type of stuff I used to do at HBO, where sports issues and commentary are what they value, not just something you try to sneak in every now and then or slip in every now and then, but something they value. It's what they're about.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Oh, okay, Mike.